story isn't for the faint of heart. It's about three siblings who went looking for a thrill, only to find a night that changed them forever. A night so thick with unease that even those who hear it told can feel a chill creep up their spine. Picture the place they found themselves in, a place that seemed, on the surface, as ordinary as any other. A building of stone and brick, worn by time, but unremarkable, the kind of place you might pass without a second thought. Just another structure where people go about their business, day after day. But that night, within its walls, something would unfold that defied every logical explanation, every comfort of reason. It was a night that began like any other, with quiet halls and stale air, nothing more than an ordinary silence. The kind that fills a room when it's empty, where no one notices. But the siblings felt it, the unseen current in the air, slipping in without warning. At first, they brushed it off as nothing. A strange feeling, perhaps, something they couldn't put into words. But as the night went on, that quiet unease grew, a whisper turning into a presence they could no longer ignore. The shadows along the walls began to gather in strange ways, stretching and shifting, almost forming shapes, clinging to the edges of their vision. Lights flickered, casting a dim, ghostly glow, as though even the building itself resisted their intrusion. And in that silence, a heavy stillness settled, the kind that wasn't just an absence of sound, but an awareness, a sense that something in that place was watching, something that did not want to be seen. One of the siblings felt it first. Alone in a hallway, she felt a cold prickling against the back of her neck, that unmistakable feeling of being watched, though no one else was there. She turned, expecting to see only darkness, yet there was movement, a shadow pulling back at the far end of the corridor. She laughed nervously, shrugging it off as her imagination. After all, buildings like these are full of creaks, strange lights, sounds that play tricks. But deep down, a small voice whispered that this wasn't just a trick of the light. Soon, the others began to notice it too. Each sibling, in their own quiet way, felt it, a sense that something was wrong. It was in the faint creak of the floorboards, each one sounding heavier, too full, as though someone else were there. It was in the sudden chills that swept through empty rooms with no open windows, in the whispers they couldn't quite hear, but all sensed, a feeling that something was moving just beyond the light, where no one should go. As the night wore on, these small, eerie moments started to add up. Shadows shifted, growing thicker, darker, becoming something more than just empty spaces. Doors that had once stayed firmly shut now stood slightly ajar, inviting them to look, to step closer. Faint echoes filled the air, footsteps moving slowly, deliberately, through empty corridors. And with every passing hour, the cold grew deeper, the silence heavier. Each sibling felt it now, that creeping dread, pushing aside every attempt to explain it away. It wasn't long before they found themselves gathering together, huddling close, the weight of fear pressing them into each other's shadows, seeking safety in numbers. They whispered among themselves, sharing the small moments that each had felt, each strange sight and sound, piecing together a pattern that was undeniable. It was no longer just one incident here, one odd noise there. It was an entire night unraveling before them. Something dark, something beyond their understanding, taking hold. And then they heard it. A sound unlike anything they had ever known, a low hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Subtle at first, like a hum of distant machinery, just on the edge of hearing. But slowly it grew louder, filling the space around them, vibrating through the walls, the floors, even the air they breathed. It pressed against their ears, making it impossible to think, to breathe, without that creeping panic starting to claw its way up inside. Then another sound joined in, a soft rustling, harder to place, like dried leaves scraping across stone or nails scratching. Each of them felt that chill burrow deeper into their skin, realizing they were hearing something they were never meant to hear. They could feel it, whatever it was, moving closer, circling them, watching for the moment their guard would slip, waiting for the fear to fully consume them. One of them, perhaps braver or more desperate than the rest, decided to investigate, stepping forward, moving slowly down the hall, drawn by the hum like a moth to flame. Every footstep echoed, filling the stillness, amplifying the tension around them. The others watched, breath held, eyes wide, as their sibling disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the shadows. Seconds ticked by, then minutes, and then nothing. No footsteps, no voice calling back, just an empty, suffocating silence. And that's when the remaining siblings felt it, the horror of realizing they were not alone in the way they had feared. There was something else with them, something more present, more aware, lurking just beyond the reach of their senses. When their sibling finally returned, they were different. Their face was pale, their eyes wide and empty, as though they had glimpsed something that had left a permanent mark on their soul. They wouldn't speak, wouldn't answer the frantic questions from the others, just stood there, unmoving, staring down the hallway as if transfixed by something only they could see. And then, as if the building itself were reacting to their terror, the last light flickered out, plunging them all into complete darkness, a blackness so thick it seemed to swallow everything. They felt it then, a breath, cold and damp, a whisper of movement that let them know they were surrounded. By what? They would never truly know, because from that moment on, reality itself began to twist, warping their senses, as though they had stepped into a place beyond understanding. What they saw, what they felt, would stay with them for the rest of their lives. This wasn't just a story to be told and forgotten. This was something that had seeped into their minds, into the shadows of their memories, casting darkness over every sense of safety they had ever known. And if you think you can simply listen to this story and walk away unscathed, think again. Because once you've heard it, once you know what they experienced, it has a way of following you too. So, are you ready to step into that night with them? If you are, just remember, some stories are meant to be forgotten. And some things, once heard, can never be erased. Imagine, if you will, the setting of this story. A place lost to time, tucked away from the noise of everyday life, left to stand in eerie isolation. The three siblings had heard about it before, in whispered tales and half-warnings, but they'd brushed it off as nothing more than urban legend. Yet there was something about this place, this abandoned hospital, that drew them in. It was as though their curiosity had led them here, to a building with walls that seemed to remember, to carry secrets too dark to reveal to just anyone. As they stepped through the entrance together, the first thing that struck them was the smell. It was a thick, stale odor, mixed with a dampness that made the air feel heavy, almost tangible. The youngest sibling felt a shiver creep up her spine, while the eldest laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. But all three of them felt it, a sense that even the air itself was resisting them, pushing back against their intrusion. The floor was coated in a fine layer of dust, broken only by the scattered remnants of things left behind. Papers, torn pieces of furniture, and old medical tools, all blanketed in silence. It wasn't an ordinary silence. It was the kind that sinks deep, pressing in from every angle, filling the space like a presence. The middle sibling looked around, feeling the oppressive quiet, as if the building itself was waiting, watching them, marking every step they took. The hallways stretched out before them, dimly lit by the occasional flicker of a dying fluorescent light that cast strange, twisting shadows. As they moved further in, the light seemed to fade, the walls narrowing and darkening, and with every step, Each sibling felt the cold seep deeper into their bones. The eldest tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just nerves, but even he couldn't deny the chill that was settling under his skin. The walls were smeared and peeling, streaked with stains that looked disturbingly fresh despite the years of neglect. The youngest glanced at the windows, hoping to see outside, but they were so thick with grime that they turned every light into a murky, sickly glow. The middle sibling reached out, touching the walls, feeling the roughness beneath her fingers, almost as if the building itself were alive, pulsing with a dark, unspoken energy. As they continued, they noticed the temperature dropping further. It was the kind of cold that felt unnatural, like the air itself had a life of its own, pressing in around them. The youngest wrapped her arms around herself, teeth chattering, but the eldest tried to laugh it off, forcing a bravado that didn't quite reach his eyes. They could each feel it, the building closing in, narrowing, as if the walls themselves were pushing them deeper into the heart of something dark. Then came the sounds. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible. A soft tapping, like footsteps coming from somewhere out of sight. The eldest stopped, listening, telling himself it was just the creaks of an old building. But the middle sibling heard it too, her heart pounding, glancing over her shoulder, unsure if the sound was coming from in front of them, behind them, or both. Each echo seemed to stretch on, filling the air, bouncing from wall to wall, fading only to return again. An endless loop that grew louder, softer, louder again. Occasionally, they'd hear a whisper, a low, breathy sound that none of them could fully understand. It was just loud enough to make them strain their ears, leaning forward, trying to catch a word, a phrase. But before they could grasp it, the sound would fade, leaving behind a feeling of dread that seemed to coil tighter with every step. It was almost as if the building was whispering to them, sharing secrets that they were never meant to know. Room after room stretched out before them, each one darker, more unsettling than the last. Empty hospital beds stood against the walls, some tipped over, others still covered in sheets that had turned brittle with age. Shadows pooled under them, dark and unmoving, and no matter how hard they tried, none of the siblings could shake the feeling that something was watching them from within those pools of darkness, something hiding just out of sight. The walls, once painted a sterile white, were now cracked and peeling, exposing patches of black mold that spread across the surface like veins, winding their way through the building's bones. The middle sibling reached out to touch one of the walls, but quickly pulled her hand back, feeling an almost electric pulse that left her fingers tingling, as though the building itself were alive, reacting to their presence. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked open, the sound so deliberate it was almost an invitation. The youngest glanced nervously at her siblings, feeling an instinct to run, but they all felt a strange pull, a compulsion to move forward, deeper into the building, as if an unseen force were guiding them step by step. Each footfall echoed louder in the silence, filling the empty hallways with a sense of foreboding that tightened around them like a vice. As they turned a corner, the hallway seemed to narrow even more, stretching into shadows that grew thicker, denser, until they could barely see a few steps ahead. The eldest held his breath, feeling the darkness pressing against him, each step slower than the last, his field of vision shrinking, as if the shadows themselves were becoming a cage, locking them in. Then came the feeling, that prickling at the back of the neck, that instinctual sense of being watched. Each sibling felt it differently. For the youngest, it was a cold shiver that made her spine tingle. For the middle sibling, it was a chill that gripped her chest, tightening with every breath. The eldest tried to brush it off, to act as if nothing were wrong, but even he felt the heaviness pressing down, his pulse quickening with every step. And just when they thought they were alone, just when they felt they might be safe, there was movement, subtle, almost imperceptible. but unmistakable. Out of the corner of their eyes, a shadow slipped across the wall, vanishing the moment they turned to face it, leaving them questioning if it had ever been there at all. The silence grew heavier, and for a fleeting moment, they could have sworn they heard something. A faint laugh, soft and breathy, drifting from nowhere and everywhere at once. In the distance, a door slammed shut, the sound so sudden it echoed through the hallways like a thunderclap, leaving them frozen in place. And with that sound came a realization, a sickening understanding that they were not alone. Whatever was in this place was aware of them. It had been watching from the moment they stepped inside, and now it wanted them to know. The silence returned, thicker than before, laced with a presence that seemed to fill the air, pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. Each sibling felt it, the youngest clutching her brother's arm, the middle sibling's hand trembling as she reached for the wall, the eldest swallowing hard, his pulse racing. They tried to brush it off, to tell themselves it was all in their heads, but every instinct warned them that something was watching, something that did not tire, something that did not blink. As they reached the end of the hallway, they saw it, a single door, slightly ajar, its rusted surface worn and scratched. Shadows gathered within, almost pulsing with an energy they could feel, a silent invitation into the unknown. They glanced at each other, each one feeling the weight of that decision, but unable to turn back, drawn forward as though by an invisible hand. The room beyond was darker than anything they had seen, the air thick, untouched by time, as if it existed outside reality. Strange symbols covered the walls, scratched in a frenzy, their meaning lost, but filled with a foreboding that made each of them shiver. The silence here was heavier, so dense it felt suffocating. And as they took that last step forward, the darkness pressed in, a presence that filled every thought, every breath, every sense. And that's when they felt it, something standing just behind them. They could feel it, a cold breath against their necks, a weight in the air. But none of them dared to turn. They couldn't. Every nerve screamed for them to run, but they were frozen, held in place by a fear so profound it took control of their bodies. In that moment, they knew they were no longer alone. Whatever was there had been waiting, watching, and now it was ready to make itself known. They say every place with a history like this leaves something behind, a memory in its walls, a scar in its foundations. But this place, this forgotten hospital, holds something much darker, something embedded in every crack and crevice, woven into the very fabric of its decaying hallways. And as the night goes on, that hidden history begins to seep through, bleeding into reality, inch by inch, detail by chilling detail. The siblings had heard the stories before. Each of them had dismissed the tales as mere superstition, the kind of ghost stories you tell to keep children from wandering into places they don't belong. But now, standing here, surrounded by shadows that seemed to shift and breathe, those stories felt far too real. It was as if the building itself was alive, each corner concealing secrets that yearned to be known, yet shied away from full revelation. In the silence, every sound was amplified. The creak of the floorboards under their feet was deafening in the oppressive quiet. Each sibling took a cautious step, followed by a pause, a shared heartbeat of hesitation. Another step. Silence. It felt as though the entire building held its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. The eldest laughed, but it was a nervous sound, a forced attempt to shake off the feeling pressing down on them. A faint rustling drifted through the air, a noise so soft it could almost be mistaken for the wind. If only there were windows open, if only there were any air at all. The sound whispered through the hallway, brushing against the walls like fingertips. The youngest sibling tensed, clutching her sister's arm as the noise grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be just behind them. But when they turned, there was nothing, just an empty corridor stretching into the darkness, filled only with the suffocating quiet that surrounded them. Then came the footsteps, faint and deliberate, echoing from somewhere further down the hall. One step, then another, before they stopped, abruptly, as though something were pausing to listen, to wait. The siblings tried to dismiss it as just an old building filled with echoes and harmless sounds. But these footsteps were different. Too deliberate, too calculated to ignore. And as they stood there, frozen, they realized the footsteps had started again, this time closer. Each footfall seemed to match the rhythm of their own racing hearts, pulsing in sync with their growing fear. The middle sibling pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat quicken as the footsteps paused again, leaving an absolute, suffocating silence in their wake. A shiver crawled up their spines, prickling the skin at the back of their necks, a sensation as physical as a hand resting there, urging them to move, to turn, to flee. But they remained rooted in place, staring down the darkened hallway, their gazes locked on the shadows stretching before them, shadows that seemed to pulse, almost alive, watching, waiting. Then, the light at the far end of the hallway began to flicker. It started as a quick, barely noticeable shudder, but then it happened again. The light dimmed and brightened rhythmically, casting strange, shifting shadows along the walls. With each flicker, the shapes on the walls seemed to transform, growing, twisting, turning into distorted forms that almost looked human, yet not quite, like something warped beyond recognition. The siblings stood transfixed, each breath shallow, as if the air around them were pressing tighter, suffocating them. A cold sweat beaded on their foreheads, a prickling unease that crept into every nerve, urging them to turn, to escape. But it felt as if the shadows themselves had woven into the walls, reaching out, wrapping around them, holding them in place. Then, just when they thought they could break free, a sound pierced the silence, a faint whisper, drifting through the air like a breeze. It was barely audible, but undeniably human, a voice that was neither near nor far, as if it came from another realm entirely. The siblings strained to hear, the words slipping away before they could make sense of them, leaving only a haunting tone that filled them with a dread they couldn't shake. It wasn't a friendly sound. It was a voice laced with something dark, something ancient, reaching out from a depth they were never meant to fathom. The whisper faded, but its chilling presence lingered, an icy trail crawling over their skin. The youngest sibling shivered, rubbing her arms, trying to rid herself of the sensation. But it clung to her, winding around her thoughts, seeping into her mind like a fog that refused to lift. In a burst of courage, the middle sibling took a step forward, inching closer to the flickering light, each step an effort against the instinct to turn and run. But as she moved, her shadow stretched before her, long and distorted, and just for an instant, she swore it moved on its own, independently, as if something else were inhabiting her reflection. She froze, blinking, trying to shake the image, but the shadow remained, stretched and twisted in ways that defied logic. It jerked forward just slightly, before settling back, only to distort again with each flicker of the light. It was as if something lurked just beneath her own reflection, something foreign and dark, hidden within her own shadow. Their heartbeats quickened in unison, and each sibling found themselves backing away, suddenly aware of every sound, every faint creak and rustle that filled the air. The walls around them seemed to close in, the shadows pressing closer, darker, until they felt less like shadows and more like something alive, something that was conscious of their every move. Finally, the eldest turned, ready to leave, to escape the suffocating weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. But as he turned, he caught a glimpse of something in the corner of his eye. A figure, standing motionless at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. The siblings looked, breath held, but they could make out nothing more than a dark silhouette, unmoving, watching, as if it had been there all along. They locked eyes with the figure, feeling a chill settle over them, a fear so deep and visceral that it gripped them, tightening with each second that passed. The figure remained still, not a breath, not a movement, yet its presence filled the space, a gaze that felt almost personal. They blinked, and the figure was gone. But the feeling it left behind remained, a weight pressing on their chests, making it difficult to breathe, hard to think, as they stood there, paralyzed by a fear they couldn't explain, a dread that felt as though it had seeped into their bones. The youngest stumbled backward, her pulse racing, her breaths quick and shallow, every sound amplified in the silence, like a drumbeat echoing through the hallway. And then, in the distance, they heard it. A soft, deliberate creak, as though a door were slowly swinging open somewhere deep within the hospital. And it was in that moment, standing in the darkened hallway, that they realized the truth. Whatever was in here with them wasn't just watching. It was waiting, and the night had only just begun. Every haunting begins somewhere, with a first encounter that tears away the last comfort of reality. For the three siblings, it began in the silence, in the place where every shadow seemed to inch closer, every flicker of light twisted into something almost alive. But what happened next shattered the fragile illusion of safety they'd clung to, tearing down the barrier between the ordinary and the unthinkable. The hallway stretched before them, narrow and dark, leading into an endless blackness. They were sure they'd come this way before, but now it felt different. The air was heavier, thick with something that clung to their skin, like a cold, unwelcome touch. In the silence, a faint creak echoed, a sound so soft it was almost a whisper, drifting from somewhere just beyond their sight. They froze, glancing at each other, each of their heartbeats pounding in unison. The eldest took a step forward, trying to steady himself, but that creak came again, this time louder, somewhere down the hall. It wasn't just the groan of old wood. This sound had a rhythm, an intention, as if it were the prelude to something that wanted them to come closer. As they took cautious steps forward, another sound joined the creak, a low, scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It was subtle, muffled, almost lost in the silence, yet somehow undeniable. The middle sibling swallowed, feeling her throat tighten, her nerves fraying with each step. She told herself it was just an old building shifting, that structures like these played tricks on the mind. But as they drew nearer, the dread grew, confirming what they all feared. This wasn't a trick. This was real. The sound grew louder with each step, and finally, there it was. A door at the end of the hallway, closed but for the faint movement of its handle, twisting ever so slowly, as if some invisible hand were on the other side. They stood there, frozen in silent horror, watching as the handle moved, back and forth with a deliberate slowness, an unnatural rhythm that sent chills through their veins. The youngest sibling squeezed her sister's hand, her breath coming faster, her fingers cold and trembling. They stared at the door, wide-eyed, unable to look away as the handle finally stopped, hanging slightly askew. The door creaked open, just a fraction, revealing only a void of darkness beyond. But this wasn't just any darkness. It was thick, a pitch-black nothingness that seemed to reach out, inviting them in, daring them to step closer. For a long, agonizing moment, they could only stare, caught in a sickening mix of curiosity and terror. Whatever lay beyond that door had made itself known, its slow, deliberate movement a statement of presence. Though every instinct screamed for them to turn back, to run, each of them felt the strange compulsion to look inside, as if some unseen force were drawing them forward. The eldest reached out first, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the handle. The door swung open with a low, groaning sound, revealing a room untouched by light. Just as they took a hesitant step inside, a flash of movement caught the middle sibling's eye. Across the wall, in a faint, red glow, words appeared, as though scrawled in a frantic hand. "Get out before it finds you." They blinked, their hearts pounding, certain their minds were playing tricks on them. They exchanged glances, eyes wide with fear, looking back at the words. But the letters remained, pulsing faintly, almost as if alive. The eldest reached out a trembling hand, fingertips inches from the wall, but suddenly, just like that, the words vanished, leaving only a blank wall. A wave of panic surged through them, and they stumbled back, colliding with the doorway, desperate to make sense of what they'd just seen. The youngest whispered to herself, trying to convince herself it wasn't real, that it was all in her mind. But as the cold sweat trickled down their necks, each of them knew this was no illusion. They were not alone. The silence was broken by another sound, a faint, scraping noise that made them jump, their gazes snapping to the corner of the room. There, just barely visible in the darkness, two eyes glistened, a pair of eyes watching them, waiting. The middle sibling stifled a scream, but as they blinked, the eyes disappeared, melting into the shadows, leaving only an afterimage, a memory that burned into their minds and made their skin crawl. Their breaths came faster, more shallow, as they tried to calm the rising panic. The eldest took a step back, pulling his siblings with him, his gaze darting from shadow to shadow, half expecting something to lunge at them. Every inch of the hallway now felt alive, each shadow a threat, each sound a warning they couldn't ignore. They tried to laugh it off, to tell themselves it was all a trick of the mind, that maybe someone had left the message on the wall as a prank. But the rationalizations felt hollow, falling flat in the oppressive quiet. It was as though the building itself rejected their attempts to explain away the terror unfolding around them. As they backed away from the room, stepping further down the hallway, the shadows seemed to grow darker, more substantial, as though something unseen was tightening its grip. Each sibling felt it, a faint pressure in their minds, an awareness that seemed to follow their every move, watching, waiting for a moment of weakness, a slip when fear would take hold completely. The youngest sibling paused, glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see something there, watching them from the shadows. But the hallway was empty. Or was it? She squinted, eyes straining against the darkness, and that's when she noticed something. An outline, barely perceptible, lingering at the edge of her vision. It was a shadow that didn't belong, a shape that swayed as though waiting for her to make a move. She swallowed, her throat dry, her pulse racing. It was then that they all realized this presence, this thing that lurked just beyond sight, had been watching them from the moment they'd entered. Each sound, each movement, was a reminder that they weren't alone, that something else had claimed this place as its own. If only they'd known what they were walking into. If only they'd understood the depth of the horror surrounding them, the dark force lying in wait, just beneath the surface. But by the time they understood, it was too late. And now, with each shadow, each whisper, every flicker of light, they understood that there was no simple way out. The place was alive, aware, and it had chosen them. This wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a threshold to something darker, something ancient, that had been waiting within the walls for anyone to come close enough to notice. But now, escape wasn't the question. It was a matter of survival. With every step they took, the hospital seemed to stir, as though waking from a long, restless slumber, disturbed by the presence of these three siblings who had ventured too far. What had started as soft whispers and shadows had now become something undeniable, something that defied all logic. They were no longer just wandering through an empty building. They were in something alive, something that breathed, something that had its own pulse. As they moved further down the corridor, every sense sharpened, every sound amplified. A chill swept over them, prickling their skin, sending shivers down each of their spines. They paused, glancing around, and that's when they saw it. A flicker of movement in a nearby room, just beyond the cracked doorway. Their hearts pounded as they edged closer, peering inside. The room appeared empty, its walls peeling, littered with broken furniture and the remnants of a past long forgotten. But in the far corner, something caught the faint light. A glint from an old photograph, half buried beneath a layer of dust, its edges curled and worn. The middle sibling hesitated, but curiosity compelled her to reach out, brushing the dust away. She squinted, adjusting her gaze, and as she did, the face in the photo became clear. It was a face that looked disturbingly familiar, yet wrong. The figure in the photo seemed to stare back at them, watching, with eyes that held a strange familiarity, something unspeakable and haunting. They exchanged glances, each one feeling the same unspoken dread. But just as the eldest turned to place the photo back on the ground, his hand froze. There was a name on the back, scrawled faintly, barely legible beneath the years of grime. As he mouthed the letters, sounding them out slowly, a chill ran down each sibling's spine. The name was his own. They all took a step back, dread filling the space around them, thick and suffocating. The photo slipped from the eldest's hand, fluttering to the floor, face down. They stared at it, speechless, feeling a wave of nausea. How could his name be on something so old, something left here untouched for what seemed like decades? Their thoughts were interrupted by a loud bang that reverberated through the hall, jolting them from their shock. They spun around, and to their horror, the door behind them had slammed shut, trapping them in the darkness. Panic set in as they rushed to the handle, pulling, twisting, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew thicker, pressing down on them, suffocating, and that's when they heard it again. The footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving toward them from somewhere deep within the hospital. They pressed their ears to the door, hearts racing, listening as the footsteps grew louder, closer, until it seemed that whatever was making them was standing right outside. They held their breath, praying it would pass, but the footsteps stopped abruptly. And in the silence that followed, they heard something else. A whisper, low and drawn out, calling each of their names in turn, savoring every syllable. The youngest sibling gasped, stumbling back, desperate to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows seemed to gather around them, thickening, pressing in, making the walls feel as though they were breathing, moving. Then, just beyond the edge of their vision, they saw it. A faint figure, standing still, watching them with hollow, unblinking eyes. Each sibling froze, paralyzed by a fear that went beyond reason. The figure drifted closer, its form hazy and indistinct, yet unmistakably human. It seemed bound to this place, tethered by something dark and twisted, something that refused to let go. The middle sibling stifled a scream as the figure reached out, its hand ghostly and pale, brushing against her arm with an icy touch that left her skin burning with cold. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, leaving only an emptiness in its wake. But the dread lingered, hanging heavy in the air like a dark cloud, a sense that something was still watching, lurking just out of sight. They stumbled out of the room, back into the hallway, each step more frantic than the last. The eldest tried to tell himself it wasn't real, that it was just a trick of the mind, but the hospital wouldn't let them forget. Every wall, every doorway, every shadow seemed to whisper, weaving together a story of fear that was impossible to escape. Further down the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out into the corridor. They approached it cautiously, drawn by an inexplicable urge to see what lay beyond. Inside, they found a small office, seemingly untouched, as if someone had just stepped away. Papers were scattered across the desk, and an old journal lay open, its pages filled with handwriting that was frantic, desperate. The eldest picked it up, reading the words scrawled across the page, each line filled with a growing sense of doom. The journal spoke of strange occurrences, doors opening and closing, whispers in the dead of night, shadows that moved with purpose. The entries grew darker, more frenzied, each one soaked in fear, as if the writer had known that whatever was in this place would come for them. And on the last page, written in shaky letters, were 3 words: "It is waiting." Cold sweat broke out across their foreheads as the siblings set the journal down, backing away from the desk. What was this presence? Why had the writer been so terrified? And more terrifyingly, was it still here? Suddenly, a faint, metallic clanging echoed from above. They looked up, watching as a single light fixture began to sway, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. The light flickered, then dimmed, then blinked out entirely, plunging them into darkness. And in that darkness, they heard it, a soft, barely there whisper, calling their names. They spun around, searching the shadows, but there was nothing, only the empty hallway and a creeping feeling that something unseen was watching, hiding just beyond their reach. The hallway seemed to stretch, twisting and warping, each step pulling them closer to something they couldn't see, yet could feel with every nerve. Then, as if answering the silent question filling their minds, they saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hall, shrouded in darkness, its face obscured, its presence oppressive. It stood there, unmoving, watching, waiting. They blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the empty hallway, but the dread remained, lingering like a stain in the air. They backed away, inching toward what they hoped was the exit, but something held them there, a compulsion to understand, to piece together what had happened in this place. They stumbled into another room, and there, scrawled across the wall in a dark, dripping substance, was a message. "You can't leave." Panic surged within them, an understanding settling in that whatever was here wasn't just haunting this place. It was bound to it, tied to every shadow, every breath of air. And now, they too were woven into its darkness, unable to escape. Why was this happening to them? Had they awakened this presence, or had it been waiting all along, lying dormant until someone dared disturb it? The questions circled in their minds, each one filling them with deeper dread, with the sickening knowledge that there would be no answers, only fear. They turned, only to feel something cold and solid behind them. Heart pounding, they found themselves face to face with yet another figure, its features sharper, more defined, eyes hollow, staring through them. Before they could scream or run, the figure reached out, placing an icy hand on the eldest's shoulder, sending a wave of cold through him that left him paralyzed, frozen in place. In that moment, they understood. They weren't just in an abandoned hospital. They were in a place that had claimed countless others, holding them captive, bound to the shadows, to the darkness, forever. And now, it had claimed them too. By now, the 3 siblings understood. This wasn't just a haunting. It was something darker, more insidious, and it had no intention of letting them go. They felt it pressing in from all sides, a presence that had grown stronger, angrier, as though it had been disturbed from a deep slumber and would stop at nothing to claim what it believed was its own. They stumbled back down the hallway, each step slower, more labored, as the darkness thickened around them. The air was heavy, oppressive, filled with a damp, earthy scent that clung to their lungs, making each breath feel like a struggle. The walls seemed to close in, the corridor shrinking, pulsing as though it were alive, drawing them deeper, further into the building's twisted heart. And then, shattering the silence, they heard it. The footsteps, heavier this time, faster, pounding through the hallways, echoing through the walls. The sound was relentless, filling every corner, growing louder, closer, until it was deafening. It was as though the very structure of the building were alive, responding to the presence with a slow, rhythmic heartbeat that resonated within their own chests. They spun around, but there was nothing there. Only shadows, stretched and distorted, reaching out from the walls, creeping across the floor, writhing like something alive. The footsteps continued, unrelenting, moving closer, only to stop suddenly, leaving a silence so intense it felt like a weight pressing down on them. The eldest led them forward, one step at a time, his heart pounding as every instinct warned them that they were not alone. Somewhere nearby, a whisper began, faint and unintelligible, just a murmur that barely rose above the silence. But with each step, the whisper grew louder, more distinct, until it was a cacophony of voices, blending, overlapping, filling their minds with sounds they couldn't escape. The middle sibling clutched her head, covering her ears, desperate to drown out the voices, but the whispers only grew louder, crawling into her thoughts, twisting them, filling every corner of her mind. The voices were all around, above, below, like a crowd of unseen figures surrounding them, each one speaking in a language she didn't understand, but could feel in her bones. Through it all, one word repeated, over and over, a name they didn't recognize, a name that wasn't theirs, yet felt familiar, like an echo from a forgotten life. The hallway seemed to shift, twisting with every step, the walls bending in unnatural ways, stretching into endless darkness, pulling them deeper into the heart of the hospital. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls, twisting into shapes that defied explanation. One moment, the shadows seemed like human figures, reaching out with incomplete, wavering hands. The next, they melted into something darker, twisted and grotesque. They stumbled forward, their breaths shallow, every nerve frayed, every instinct screaming to turn back, to escape. But it was too late. The presence was everywhere, surrounding them, filling the air with a suffocating heat that felt alive, pulsing, almost breathing. They could feel it pressing against their skin, seeping into their thoughts, twisting their memories, making it impossible to think, to reason. At last, they reached a doorway at the end of the hall, a final exit. But just as they reached for the handle, a gust of freezing air swept through, slamming the door shut with a force that shook the walls. The sound echoed through the corridor, leaving them standing in stunned silence, their hands outstretched, mere inches from the handle. And then, darkness. The lights blinked out, plunging them into a void so complete it felt like an abyss, an endless darkness that swallowed everything. In that blackness, they saw them, faint, ghostly figures drifting through the shadows, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes empty, staring, watching, waiting. The figures moved closer, drifting with an unnatural, eerie grace, each one trailing shadows that seemed to pulse and twist like something alive. Their faces were familiar, yet wrong, distorted, as though they had once been human, but had become something corrupted. One figure stopped, inches away from the eldest, and he felt its cold breath brush against his skin, a chill that seeped into his bones, numbing every thought, every sense. The figure leaned forward, its eyes unblinking, its mouth twisting into a hollow, unnatural smile that filled him with a dread so deep It felt like it would consume him. And then, a flash. The lights flickered back on, illuminating the hallway. It was empty now, the figures gone, leaving only a faint mist clinging to the air like a memory, like a stain. They each took a step back, breaths shallow, hearts racing, feeling the presence still around them, still watching, though unseen, hidden just beyond the reach of the light. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the air with a relentless, insistent murmur that seemed to come from the walls, the floors, the very foundation of the building. It was everywhere, pressing against their minds, forcing its way into their thoughts, until they could hear nothing else, see nothing else, feel nothing else. They turned, desperate to escape, to find a way out, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and warping into shapes that defied logic. Every door they passed was locked, every window barred, as though the hospital itself were conspiring to keep them trapped, to prevent any chance of escape. They ran, each footfall echoing through the corridor, each breath ragged, each heartbeat pounding like a drum. The lights flickered again, casting brief glimpses of the shadows that pursued them, twisting and shifting with every movement. They could see the figures now, clearer than before, their faces twisted in silent screams, eyes hollow, watching, waiting, moving closer with each flicker. In the distance, they heard a door creak open, sharp and clear in the silence, a beacon of hope, a chance for escape. They stumbled toward it, lungs burning, but as they reached it, a shadow drifted across the doorway, blocking their path. They froze, a cold sweat breaking out across their skin as the shadow took form, solidifying into a figure whose smile was anything but friendly. The figure moved closer, slow and deliberate, each step stretching into eternity, each second filled with a growing sense of dread. They backed away, hearts pounding, as the figure raised a hand, pointing, its gaze locked onto theirs with a piercing intensity that felt like it might cut straight through them. And then, with a final flicker, the lights went out again, leaving them in darkness, in silence, with nothing but the faint, icy presence pressing against their skin, filling their thoughts, consuming them. The darkness pulsed, breathing, wrapping around them like a shroud, a suffocating, inescapable presence that left them gasping for air, desperate for even the smallest hint of light. And in that darkness, they realized there was no escape. They were trapped, surrounded, and whatever had claimed this place had claimed them too. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling their minds with thoughts that weren't their own, twisting their memories, their very sense of self, until they weren't sure where they ended and the presence began. It was everywhere, inside them, around them, consuming them, erasing them, replacing them. And in that final moment, just as the darkness closed in completely, they understood. This place, this presence, it wasn't just a haunting. It was a hunger, a force that devoured everything in its path, consuming souls, erasing lives, leaving nothing but shadows, echoes, memories. The last thing they saw before the darkness swallowed them whole was a face, pale, hollow, twisted, staring back at them from the shadows, a reflection of what they had become, of what they would be, forever. And then, silence. A silence so deep, so complete, it felt like the end of everything. And in that silence, the presence lingered, watching, waiting, for the next soul to wander into its grasp, to become part of the darkness, part of the story, forever. The three siblings' breaths came shallow, sharp, each one a struggle against the suffocating weight pressing in from all sides. The shadows around them pulsed, thickened, as if alive, closing in until they could feel it. Something close, far too close. Cold beads of sweat trickled down each of their backs, muscles tense, ready to bolt, to do anything to escape this waking nightmare. But where could they run? Every door was locked, every hallway twisted into something impossible. And now, it was here, right here, with them. They took cautious steps back, eyes darting through the darkness, searching for any sign of movement, any sign of life. But the silence was thick, suffocating. And then, there it was, a faint, icy touch against the youngest sibling's shoulder, like ghostly fingers grazing her skin. She gasped, every nerve in her body screaming as they spun around, desperately searching, but nothing. Only shadows. And yet, there it was, just inches away. A face, pale, hollow, floating just beyond the edge of the light, staring with eyes that seemed empty yet alive, filled with a dark malevolence that pierced straight through them. Its mouth stretched into an unnatural, widening grin that seemed capable of swallowing them whole. And then it spoke, a low, raspy whisper that sounded like the wind through a graveyard, chilling them to their core. It said their names, one after the other, each one drawn out, savoring each syllable like a predator savoring its prey. The middle sibling stumbled backward, her feet tangling as she reached for something, anything, to steady herself. But the walls felt wrong, slick, almost alive, pulsing beneath her touch. The figure floated forward with an eerie grace, its hollow eyes fixed on them, its twisted grin never fading. They couldn't look away. They couldn't breathe. They couldn't think. They turned to run, desperation overtaking reason, but each hallway twisted into an endless maze. No matter how fast they moved, the figure was always there, just behind them, moving silently, its twisted smile wide and unyielding. The walls around them seemed to breathe, stretching, twisting, trapping them within a labyrinth with no escape. A door appeared ahead, faintly visible in the darkness. The eldest lunged for it, hand outstretched, fingers grazing the cold metal handle. And then, with a deafening bang, the door slammed shut, locking them in place. The sound echoed through the corridor, leaving them frozen in shock, hand hovering in the air, breath caught in their throats. The figure moved closer, its face illuminated by a faint, ghostly light, revealing distorted features, hollow eyes, and a mouth stretched into a smile that was anything but human. Its gaze locked onto them, and in that moment, they felt it. A flood of memories, images of others who had wandered here, all trapped, all claimed by this entity that fed on their fear, their souls, their very essence. The youngest sibling clutched her head, desperate to escape the onslaught of memories that weren't hers, memories that left a dark, indelible mark on her mind. The walls seemed to close in, pressing closer, tighter, as though the building itself were alive, working against them, holding them in place, refusing to let go. In a burst of desperation, they turned again, bolting down a narrow hallway, their feet pounding against the floor as the figure drifted silently behind, relentless, its empty eyes never leaving them. They felt it right behind them, a chill that seemed to wrap around their minds, seeping into their thoughts. They burst into a larger room, empty and silent, with only the faint hum of the building settling. For a fleeting moment, they thought they might be alone, thought they had escaped. But then, a creak, a soft, barely audible sound from the corner of the room. They froze, each muscle tense, every sense on high alert. Slowly they turned, and there, just at the edge of the dim light, it stood. The figure, watching, waiting, its hollow eyes reflecting a darkness that went beyond mere shadows, a darkness that seemed to pull them in, to consume every thought, every breath, every last shred of hope. And then it moved, faster than they could react. One moment it was across the room, the next it was right in front of them, its face inches away, its cold breath brushing against their skin, sending a wave of ice through their veins. They felt its presence pressing down on them, filling every inch of their being with a dread so profound it seemed to drain them of strength, of will. Its hand reached out, a pale, skeletal hand, brushing against the eldest's cheek with a touch that felt both real and unreal, a shadow made flesh. The touch burned, leaving an icy, searing mark that seemed to sink deeper than skin, leaving a stain on his very soul. He tried to pull away, but the hand tightened, holding him in place, forcing him to look into those endless, hollow eyes. A scream built in their throats, but no sound came. They were trapped, held by a force they couldn't fight, couldn't understand. The figure leaned closer, its mouth widening, an endless void stretching into darkness, pulling them in, consuming them. And in that moment they knew this was the end. But then, a flicker, a glimmer of light, faint, far away, just enough to break the hold, to give them one last chance. With a final surge of strength, they tore themselves free, stumbling back, gasping for air, hearts racing, every nerve on fire. They turned, running with a desperation they'd never known, every step fueled by a primal instinct to survive. The figure was a shadow at their backs, its presence pressing closer, colder, darker, reaching out with hands that clawed at the edges of their minds, their souls. Bursting through a door, they stumbled into the open air, into the night, gasping, their hearts pounding as the weight of the darkness finally lifted. They looked back, catching a glimpse of that twisted smile in the window, realizing with horror that it was never really over. They could still feel it. A faint, lingering presence. A shadow that would follow them, haunt them forever. A reminder of the darkness that lurks just beyond the edge of reality. And as they walked away, leaving that place behind, they could still hear it. The whisper of their names, echoing through the night, promising that one day it would find them again. They thought they were free. The cold night air felt sharp, almost painfully fresh, a rush of reality after being submerged in deep, dark waters. Every sound around them, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of passing cars, felt acutely real, grounding them in a way that seemed to pull them back to life. They wanted to believe it was over, that the darkness was sealed away within those cursed walls, forever behind them. But deep down, a part of each of them knew this wasn't the end. The first night after their escape, sleep was elusive. Every shadow that drifted across the room, every faint creak of the house settling, brought back the memories of that hollow, unblinking gaze, that twisted, knowing smile. They lay awake, staring into the dark, waiting for the whispers, the faint, rhythmic footsteps. But the night passed quietly, and with the dawn came a fragile sense of relief. Days turned into weeks. They tried to bury the memory, to drown it in the noise and routine of everyday life, convincing themselves that it was all in their minds, just a twisted nightmare that would eventually fade. But it wasn't that simple. Something had changed. Every now and then, a chill would run down their spines, an inexplicable feeling of being watched, of eyes lingering on them from just beyond sight. A shadow would flicker in the corner of their eye, stretch too far, linger a bit too long. They told themselves it was paranoia, just remnants of fear clinging to their thoughts. But as the weeks became months, the signs grew harder to ignore. Doors they were certain they had locked would be found open. Lights flickered without reason, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched along the walls, shifting into shapes they recognized all too well. Sometimes, in the dead of night, as they lay on the edge of sleep, they would hear it. A faint whisper, distant yet unmistakable, calling their names. They tried to talk about it, to share what had happened, but the words always seemed to die on their tongues, leaving them with a heavy, unshakable silence, as though some unseen force was preventing them from speaking. And maybe it was. One night, desperate to release the weight pressing on their minds, they took up an old journal, hoping that writing might ease the growing dread. But as they began to write, an eerie sensation washed over them, a feeling of not being alone. The words flowed, but as they watched, the letters began to blur, smudging and twisting until they could no longer decipher what they had written. Heart racing, they dropped the pen, staring at the page, only to see new words appear, scrawled in a hand that wasn't theirs. "It is waiting." The words pulsed on the page, dark and sinister, as though something were pressing itself into the very ink, claiming it. They shut the journal quickly, their hands shaking, knowing now that they were not truly free. Whatever they had encountered in that place had followed them, like a shadow bound to them, inescapable. After that, they could no longer ignore the signs. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, echoing through their minds at all hours, as though the presence were calling to them, pulling them back. They heard it in crowded rooms, in quiet, empty spaces, in dreams that turned to nightmares the moment they closed their eyes. Each time, it left them with a bone-deep dread, a certainty that their escape had been nothing more than an illusion. As the months passed, they began to see things. A figure in a window, watching them with that hollow, endless gaze, disappearing the moment they looked. Footsteps echoed through their home late at night, slow, deliberate, as though the presence were wandering, searching, waiting. And sometimes, just sometimes, they would catch a glimpse of a face in the mirror, a face that wasn't theirs, pale and twisted, smiling back with a darkness that chilled them to the core. They tried everything to shake it, moving to a new city, changing routines, even consulting those who claimed to understand how to dispel such forces. But nothing worked. The presence was always there, lurking in the corners, watching, growing stronger with each passing day. And now, as they sit in silence, staring into the dark, they understand. They are no longer the same people who left that building, no longer the same people who tried to forget. A part of each of them remains there, trapped, tethered to that place by the thing that claimed them, bound to it by a thread of fear, a darkness that has wrapped itself around their souls. They know, with a growing certainty, that one day they will return to that place, drawn back by the whispers, by the figure that waits in the shadows. But this time, it will be different. This time, they will walk willingly into the darkness, accepting the fate they cannot escape, the shadow that will follow them into eternity. And when that day comes, they will join the others, the countless souls claimed by the place without a name, by the presence that will never let them go. And so, as they sit alone in the silence, listening to the faint, distant whisper that fills the room, they understand. This was never just a building, never merely a haunting. It was a hunger, a force that feeds on fear, despair, on the very souls of those who dare enter. As they close their eyes, a final thought drifts into their minds, a thought that will haunt them until the end. It is waiting, and they know, as they drift into uneasy sleep, that it always will. Now that you've heard this story, what do you think? Could something like this really happen? Or is it simply an unsettling tale, a trick of the mind? Consider this. Could a place truly hold on to the memories of those who enter, trapping a piece of their soul, haunting them long after they've gone? Or was it all just in their heads? As you sit there, perhaps alone, maybe even noticing the room feels just a bit darker, a bit colder. Ask yourself, have you ever felt that way? Have you ever been in a place that seemed to leave an imprint on you? Something you couldn't quite shake, even long after leaving? A place that seemed to watch you, breathe around you, remember you? If so, Maybe you understand what our characters went through. Maybe even more than you'd like. Tell us, have you ever experienced something like this? A night when reality seemed to shift, when shadows stretched too far, or whispers seemed to fill empty rooms? Have you ever felt the sensation of being watched from just beyond sight, knowing that something was there even if you couldn't see it? If so, share your story in the comments. If you dare,